Hi guys, let's start chapter 2, that is the nationalist movement in Indochina. Vietnam gained formal independence in 1945. So, Vietnam gained formal independence in 1945 before India. India got on 1947. But it took another 3 decades of fighting before the Republic of Vietnam was formed. But still, they took 3 decades of fighting before the Republic of Vietnam was formed. So, this chapter on Indochina will introduce you to one of the important states of the peninsula, namely Vietnam. Nationalism in Indochina developed in a colonial context. The knitting together of a modern Vietnamese nation that brought the different communities together was in part the result of colonization, but as importantly, it was shaped by the struggle against colonial domination. So, the Vietnam as a nation, it was importantly it was shaped by the struggle against colonial domination. If you see the historical experience of Indochina in relation to that of India, you will discover important differences in the way colonial empires functioned and the anti imperial movement developed. By looking at such differences and similarities, you can understand the variety of ways in which nationalism has developed and shaped the contemporary world. So here's a figure. Here's Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. So we have here Laos, here is Vietnam, and here is Cambodia. Okay, then figure 1, map of Indochina. Number 1, emerging from the shadow of China. Indochina comprises the modern countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which are shown in figure 1. Its early history shows many different groups of people living in this area under the shadow of the powerful empire of China. Even when an independent country was established in what is now northern and central Vietnam, its rulers continued to maintain the Chinese system of government as well as Chinese culture. Vietnam was also linked to what has been called the Maritime Silk Route. So, Vietnam was also linked to what has been called the Maritime Silk Route that brought in goods, people, and ideas. Other networks of trade connected it to the hinterlands where non Vietnamese people, such as the Khmer Cambodians, lived. So here's the figure 2, the port of Fifo. This port was founded by Portuguese merchants. It was one of the ports used by European trading companies much before the 19th century. 1.1, Colonial domination and resistance. The colonization of Vietnam by the French brought the people of the country into conflict with the colonizers in all areas of life. The most visible form of French control was military and economic domination, but the French also built a system that tried to reshape the culture of the Vietnamese. So, the most visible form of French control was military and economic domination, but the French also built a system that tried to reshape the culture of the Vietnamese. Nationalism in Vietnam emerged through the efforts of different sections of society to fight against the French and all they represented. So the nationalism in Vietnam, it emerged through the efforts of different sections of society to fight against the French. Then here's a figure. Figure 3. Francis Guernier, a French officer who led an attack against the ruling Nguyen dynasty, being killed by soldiers of the court. Guernier was part of the French team that explored the Mekong River in 1873. He was commissioned by the French to try and establish a French colony in Tonkin in the north. Guernier carried out an attack on Hanoi, the capital of Tonkin, but was killed in the fight. Here's another figure. Figure 4. Figure 4. The Mekong River Engraving by the French exploratory force in which Guernier participated. Exploring and mapping rivers was part of the colonial enterprise everywhere in the world. Colonizers wanted to know the route of the rivers, their origin, and the terrain they passed through. The rivers could then be properly used for trade and transport. During these explorations, innumerable pictures and maps were produced. Okay, so let's start. French troops landed in Vietnam in 1858. So, the French troops landed in Vietnam in 1858, and by the mid 1880s, they had established a firm grip over the northern region. After the Franco-Chinese War, the French assumed control of Tonkin and Nam, and in 1887, French Indochina was formed. So a French Indochina was formed. In the following decades, the French sought to consolidate their position, and people in Vietnam began reflecting on the nature of the loss that Vietnam was suffering. Nationalist resistance developed out of this reflection. The famous blind poet Nguyen Dinh Chieu 1822 to 88 bemoaned what was happening to his country. So a famous blind poet, Nguyen Dinh Chieu, 1822 to 88, he mourned what was happening in his country. I would rather face eternal darkness than see the faces of traitors. I would rather see no man than encounter one man's sufferings. I would rather see nothing than to witness the dismembering of the country in decline. 1.2. Why the French thought colonies necessary. Colonies were considered essential to supply natural resources and other essential goods. Like other Western nations, France also thought it was the mission of the advanced European countries to bring the benefits of civilization to backward peoples. The French began by building canals and draining lands in the Mekong Delta to increase cultivation. The vast system of irrigation works, like canals and earthworks, built mainly with forced labor, increased rice production. So the irrigation system, because of that, it increased rice production and allowed the export of rice to the international market. The area under rice cultivation went up from 274,000 hectares in 1873 to 1.1 million hectares in 1900 and 2.2 million in 1930. Vietnam exported two-thirds of its rice production and by 1931 had become the third largest exporter of rice in the world. This was followed by infrastructure projects to help transport goods for trade, move military garrisons, and control the entire region. Construction of a trans-Indochina rail network that would link the northern and southern parts of Vietnam and China was begun. This final link with Yunnan in China was completed in 1910. So the rail link was completed in 1910. The second line was also built linking Vietnam to Siam as Thailand was then called. Okay, so Thailand was called Siam. The first link was from Vietnam and okay, the link was between northern and southern parts of Vietnam and China. And the second one was from Vietnam to Siam. So Siam is Thailand. And it would pass the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh. So it would pass through Phnom Penh too. Then by the 1920s, to ensure higher levels of profit for their businesses, French business interests were pressuring the government in Vietnam to develop the infrastructure further. 1.3 Should colonies be developed? Everyone agreed that colonies had to serve the interest of the mother country, but the question was how. Some, like Paul Bernard, an influential writer and policy maker, strongly believed that the economy of the colonies needed to be developed. He argued that the purpose of acquiring colonies was to make profit. So, the purpose of acquiring colonies was to make profits. If the economy was developed and the standard of living of the people improved, they would buy more goods. The market would subsequently expand, leading to better profits for French business. Bernard suggested that there were several barriers to economic growth in Vietnam, like high population levels, low agricultural productivity, and extensive indebtedness amongst the peasants. To reduce rural poverty and increase agricultural productivity, it was necessary to carry out land reforms as the Japanese had done in the 1890s. However, this could not ensure sufficient employment. As the experience of Japan showed, industrialization would be essential to create more jobs. The colonial economy in Vietnam. So, the colonial economy in Vietnam was, however, primarily based on rice cultivation. So, it was based on rice cultivation and rubber plantations owned by the French and a small Vietnamese elite. Rail and export facilities were set up to service this sector. Endangered Vietnamese labor was widely used in the rubber plantations. So, what does this endangered mean? Endangered labor, a form of labor widely used in the plantations from the mid 19th century. Laborers worked on the basis of contracts that did not specify any rights of laborers but gave immense power to employers. Employers could bring criminal charges against laborers and punish and jail them for non fulfillment of contracts. So, endangered Vietnamese labor was widely used in the rubber plantations. The French, contrary to what Bernard would have liked, did little to industrialize the economy. In the rural areas, landlordism spread and the standard of living declined. Here's a new figure, figure 5. A French weapons merchant, Jean Dupuis, in Vietnam in the late 19th century. Many like him explored the reasons in the hope of making profits from trade. He was one of those who persuaded the French to try and establish a base in Vietnam. 2. The dilemma of colonial education. French colonization was not based only on economic exploitation, it was also driven by the idea of a civilizing mission. Like the British in India, the French claimed that they were bringing modern civilization to the Vietnamese. They took for granted that Europe had developed the most advanced civilization. So it became the duty of the Europeans to introduce these modern ideas to the colony even if this meant destroying local cultures, religions, and traditions, because these were seen as outdated and prevented modern development. Education was seen as one way to civilize the native. So education was a one way to civilize the native. But in order to educate them, the French had to resolve a dilemma. How far were the Vietnamese to be educated? The French needed an educated local labor force, but they feared that education might create problems. Once educated, the Vietnamese may begin to question colonial domination. Moreover, French citizens living in Vietnam called colons. So the French citizens living in Vietnam are called colons, and they begin fearing that they might lose their jobs as teachers, shopkeepers, policemen to the educated Vietnamese. So they opposed policies that would give the Vietnamese full access to French education. 2.1 Talking Modern. The French were faced with yet another problem in the sphere of education. The elites in Vietnam were powerfully influenced by Chinese culture. So the elites in Vietnam were powerfully influenced by Chinese culture. To consolidate their power, the French had to counter this Chinese influence. So they systematically dismantled the traditional education system and established French schools for the Vietnamese. But this was not easy. Chinese, the language used by the elite so far, had to be replaced. But what was to take its place? Was the language to be Vietnamese or French? There were two broad opinions on this question. Some policymakers emphasized the need to use the French language as the medium of instruction. By learning the language, they felt the Vietnamese would be introduced to the culture and civilization of France. This would help create an Asiatic France solidly tied to European France. The educated people in Vietnam would respect French sentiments and ideals, see the superiority of French culture, and work for the French. Others were opposed to French being the only medium of instruction. They suggested that Vietnamese be taught in lower classes and French in the higher classes. The few who learned French and acquired French culture were to be rewarded with French citizenship. So, those who learned French and acquired French culture were to be rewarded with French citizenship. However, only the Vietnamese elite, comprising a small fraction of the population, could enroll in the schools, and only a few among those admitted ultimately passed the school leaving examination. So, only a few. The Vietnamese elite, comprising a small fraction of the population, could enroll in these schools, and only a few among those admitted ultimately passed the school leaving examination. This was largely because of a deliberate policy of failing students, particularly in the final year, so that they could not qualify for the better paid jobs. So, what they did was that they deliberately failed the students. So it was a deliberate policy of failing students, particularly in the final year, so that they could not qualify for the better paid jobs. Usually, as many as two-thirds of the students failed. In 1925, in a population of 17 millions, there were less than 400 who passed the examination. School textbooks glorified the French and justified colonial rule. The Vietnamese were represented as primitive and backward, incapable of manual labor, but not of intellectual reflection. Okay, so the Vietnamese were represented as primitive and backward, capable of manual labor, but not of intellectual reflection. They could work in the fields but not rule themselves. They were skilled copyists but not creative. School children were taught that only French rule could ensure peace in Vietnam. Since the establishment of French rule, the Vietnamese peasants no longer lives in constant terror of pirates. Calm is complete, and the peasant can work with a good heart. So, school children were told that only French rule could ensure peace in Vietnam. Since the establishment of French rule, the Vietnamese peasant no longer lives in constant terror of pirates. Calm is complete, and the peasant can work with a good heart. So, here's a figure. Figure 6. A local caricature ridiculing the Vietnamese who has been westernized. Abandoning his own culture, he has begun wearing Western clothes and playing tennis. 2.2 Looking Modern. The Tonkin Free School. So, the Tonkin Free School was started in 1907 to provide a Western style education. This education included classes in science, hygiene, and French. These classes were held in the evening and had to be paid for separately. The school's approach to which it meant to be modern is a good example of the thinking prevalent at that time. It was not enough to learn science and Western ideas to be modern. The Vietnamese had to also look modern. Okay, it was not enough to learn science and Western ideas. To be modern, the Vietnamese had to also look modern. The school encouraged the adoption of Western styles such as having a short haircut. For the Vietnamese, this meant a major break with their own identity since they traditionally kept long hair. To underline the importance of a total change, there was even a haircutting chant. So, to underline the importance of a total change, there was even a haircutting chant. Comb in the left hand, scissors in the right. Snip, snip, clip, clip. Watch out, be careful. Drop stupid practices. Dump childish things. Speak openly and frankly. Study Western customs. Okay, so that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.